Especially since I'm talking about this. So you're going from BitTorrent to dynamic static site strategies. Whoa, amazing. So hello, first of all. I should probably dig into what I mean by this, because you might have noticed that there's a bit of a tautology in there. You know, dynamic and static together in the same sentence don't make a lot of sense. But I was tinkering with titles for this talk, trying desperately to find a way to make it sound a little bit more interesting. You know, it sounds a bit dry. So at one point, it's about static site generators. So I was thinking, okay, maybe I could be playful with that. SSGWiz, that sounds a bit more interesting. But I moved away from that because SSGWiz does sound like a really bad name for a battleship. So it doesn't seem quite appropriate. So we're back with dynamic static site strategies, which apart from not making a lot of sense, also is really difficult to say. So I'm not going to say it again, thankfully. A quick introduction to me. So I'm Phil. I work at an agency in London called RGA, and we make stuff for the web and applications and products and kind of do marketing and that kind of stuff. I know we're really tight on time today, so hopefully we'll have some time for some questions. Are we going to fix this? Yeah, fine. Or we're going to try? Sorry. No worries. Ooh. How's that? Any better? No? Oh. Yes? No? No? Can I get it? Yeah. Thank you. This is fine. This is my ego slide anyway, so we'll stick with that. Yeah, so we're kind of short on time, getting shorter on time. So if we don't have time for any questions, you can tweet at me and grab me afterwards. I know from going to the kind of the lightning talks last night, the keyboard warriors talks, there are some opinions in this room, some smart people. So there may be some people who disagree with me or want to ask questions or have a row. That's fine. So anyway, at RGA we make stuff for clients, as I mentioned, but my history is in making stuff for the front end. I'm basically a front-end developer. And building stuff for the front end has changed a lot. I know there are lots of people in the room who build things with JavaScript. And it used to be that we'd have conversations about what we do. I'd have a conversation like this very regularly in bars. This isn't my opening gambit in a bar, but nonetheless. People ask, what do you do? I say, I'm a software engineer, and they'd say, oh, that's interesting. What language do you work in? I'd say JavaScript. And then they'd have this kind of reaction, which I think most of us have experienced some way down the line. It's kind of a bit frustrating. People who were at the lightning talks last night probably recognize this as one of the clues from the regex crossword, nonetheless. But times have changed, right? So now we've got much greater tools, much better kind of engineering resources at our fingertips. And that's a bit of a double-edged sword, because there's a lot of things emerging and it's kind of trendy. There are lots of trendy frameworks to keep up with, and there's always things that are fashionable and people are opinionated and what have you. And I kind of think of this kind of hipster tax of trying to keep up to date with the latest technologies and learning all the new things as they come along. But I kind of think a little bit about the good old days of web development, where things were really, really simple. When I started building things for the web at university, web development wasn't part of the syllabus then, which dates me a little bit. But I did discover that when I was at uni, I had this miraculous folder in my home drive, this htdocs directory. Didn't know anything about it. I later learned that it was the hypertext documents directory, and anything that I put in there magically appeared on this URL, which was incredibly exciting. Before anyone reaches, well, there's no Wi-Fi, so I don't need to worry about people going and finding this, but there's nothing there anymore. Thankfully, that would shame me. But one of the things I loved about working there was that it started really simple. There was this lovely kind of feedback loop. You'd write text and then you'd save it, and then you'd refresh your browser and see the results immediately. This really short feedback loop, and you'd kind of repeat that process, and it was a wonderful thing. But it was all very static, and we were starting simple. And then over time, we kind of tried to get a bit more ambitious, tried to make things a little bit more dynamic. And I had no clue as to how to go about doing that when I was starting out. So I asked someone who was a few years ahead of me at university, who'd been studying these kind of things for a bit longer, and asked him, how do I make things dynamic here? And he said, oh, well, you need a CG bin. And I just looked at him blankly, and so, of course, he was talking about a CGI bin, where you can start kind of bringing your server-side code in there. And it really was kind of my introduction to kind of plumbing and infrastructure and the kind of things that happen in the back end to make things a little bit more dynamic. Now, I see at the moment there's actually a chance to return to simplicity, to kind of those simpler days of building things just with a bit more immediacy and not having to worry about the complexity that all of that server-side infrastructure necessitates. And let me kind of talk about what the challenge of doing that might be, and then later on we'll maybe talk about why and hopefully get to look at some examples. So, as I said, at RGA, I work on building things for clients, and no matter what kind of place you work in, if you're working for large clients, small clients, internal clients, or building something for yourself, the chances are when you're building things for the web, there's a bunch of things you're probably going to need. And so, clients often come and they want a beautiful site, and they want clear, well-structured, architected content, and they want to have good browser support, of course. Hopefully, we're going to be able to bring them something that loads quickly. I know we're going to be talking a little bit later about performance today, really important. But then there's also a bunch of other things, like they're going to want the site to be easy to update. They're probably going to want some kind of a CMS, which is another whole sore point for me. But we won't go down that road now. But they need the content to be dynamic, and hopefully they're going to want sensible URLs. I was delighted, to hear Eric talking about the importance of URLs earlier on as well. And often what they come to you and ask for is they say, "Oh, I want a mobile-first responsive web app," and I don't know what that is. It seems like a bunch of buzzwords kind of conjoined together. And actually, in fact, they normally ask for a mobile-first responsive web app because in one word, because it's trending, and they know that that's popular. It's good to hear that other people feel the same pain. But what they mean, of course, when they say this is this. That's what they want. They want a website. But if we look back at this list again of what might go into a website, there's a bunch of things that are there that are reasonably simple to achieve. And then there's this stuff over here, which you might think, well, that's where we really need some plumbing and some infrastructure. So the question that I'm kind of posing here is, is this possible only with a dynamic server infrastructure? And either we're going to have an early lunch, or the answer to this question I'm going to suggest is no. So this talk really is about looking at how we might have a static architecture that gives dynamic features. And to understand, try and answer that, we need to understand what dynamic really means. And it can mean a bunch of different things. We were talking last night at the Lightning Talks about this and say, well, it could be kind of personalized content, or it could be user-generated content. But often, dynamic, when we're thinking about a dynamic site, often actually that just means that there's a short time to refresh that. Time to publish is really important. How quickly can we keep the site live? Keeping it fresh is really important, especially when you can think about how stale things can get otherwise. So there are challenges in doing this. Kind of, you'd expect to bring a dynamic infrastructure into place to deliver that. And one of the things that I've found is that if you're working with certain types of client, getting that infrastructure in place is really problematic. It's really tough. There are a bunch of enterprises that I've worked with, not all, but many, who kind of have this separation. They kind of think of these things differently. They think of code deployment, so in other words, all of the infrastructure, anything that might touch a database, the plumbing, the logic that's going to execute on their servers. And they also think of content deployment, which could be the content as we might traditionally think of it, but they also consider CSS, sometimes even JavaScript, and static assets as content. And those two things undergo a completely different level of rigor when it comes to the audits that go into seeing if you were allowed to deploy that in the first place. And as you might imagine, the bottom of this, the content deployment, is something that you can deploy much more readily than the top. And so with that in mind, there's a bit of an opportunity to try and make our life easier if we're working in those contexts. Now, as we talked about before, there are many different types of sites, and really this is only going to work if we're really consider very honest use cases. There are lots of things that people might want that really they ain't going to need. So for the purposes of this, we're going to rule out targeted content. We're going to be serving the same content to everyone. It's kind of a read-only experience, but critically it's read often. It's the kind of thing that you might return to often, and it feels dynamic in that way. So if that's the case, then hopefully we can actually make everything faster. So I'm going to introduce you to a really groundbreaking new approach and a little expression that has only been around since 2002, so very, very recent. And it's this idea, this maxim that Aaron Swartz posited back in 2002, where he was saying, well, rather than frying the content whenever a user comes and requests it, we should bake it in advance. So it's this maxim of bake, don't fry. And Aaron, this is Aaron, back then, a big contributor to Creative Commons and lots of good work on the web. He wrote this post when he was thinking about this problem, and he kind of came to kind of think about this expression of bake, don't fry. And he was essentially running his blog, and it was painful, and he was looking at ways that he could make it simpler. And he stumbled across this CMS which was written in Perl called WebMake. Now, it's 2002, it's a CMS, it's written in Perl. I'm sure we'd all like to see what the logo for it was. Boom, there it is, yeah. 2002 glory. I'm sure there's some animated GIFs in the background tiled as well, hopefully. But the key thing that this did was it was a tool that would bake out the content. It was essentially a static site generator. And Aaron has in that article, which is kind of a good read, he says something which really struck a chord with me. He said, now I care about not having to maintain cranky AOL server, Postgres, and Oracle installs. That kind of sounds a bit familiar, especially when we're trying to reduce complexity and make it easier to develop things in the first place. And so if we can actually do this and end up in a position where we're generating static files that we deploy somewhere, it means that we've got hugely increased portability. Finding somewhere to host these kind of assets at scale is really, really simple. Who in the room, just as a quick show of hands, who has or has ever had a blog? Could you raise your hand? Okay, a bunch of people. How many people have decided to move it onto a new platform or redesign it or do something with it at some point? Okay, and another bunch of people. Many people ever seen a screen that looks a bit like this, that is kind of, your database is hosted on WordPress, or one looks like this that has lots of errors and then says success at the end. I should be really clear, I'm not bashing WordPress at all. WordPress is a fantastic product, and I think it's incredibly powerful, and I know that we've used it a lot at RGA, but you have to choose what you use it for. But the point I'm trying to make here is that even with something as simple and as accessible and as well supported as WordPress, it has an overhead of some infrastructure costs, or there are things that can degrade over time or fall out of support, and it just can reduce your confidence. And confidence is the kind of thing that we want to have lots of when we're building things and letting them live out on the web. I'm going to use a dirty couple of words here. Whoa, enterprise compliance. I was talking earlier on about this notion of code deployments or content deployments. But I've found that trying to use things like WordPress or other tools, I'm not singling out WordPress, things that have infrastructure in the back end, they all come under scrutiny from the enterprise, and different places have different constraints, of course. But typically they're going to perform some kind of security audit, and they're going to do some penetration testing, load testing, all that kind of stuff. So there are some opportunities for us to kind of make this much simpler and build things out that we can deploy and get out into the world without a lot of this pain. There are also lots of performance gains here as well. I mean, there are lots of things that, lots of reasons why this performs faster, but it's not all about that. But there are some gains to be had. When we look at the fact that this is a file-based architecture we're talking about, we've just got static files. It means that we can respond to the requests for these things really fast, and of course, it's caching and what have you would sit on top of that anyway. But the infrastructure to make this happen and the understanding to make this happen are quite simple, so that helps with our costs. Hosting is going to be cheaper, and at scale this can be big. I moved a bunch of my sites which gain very little traffic, and even at that point I was saving some money. So for big sites, this can be huge. And of course, the cost of maintenance is a big concern as well, right? If you've got less infrastructure and fewer servers, and you've got less production code, then maintaining it is simpler. The skills you need to maintain it are simpler. Okay, I'm banging on about the advantages, but really we should look at why or how this has become much more viable. So, really what are these tools that make it easier to be dynamic through kind of faster iteration of your sites? So we're just going to look at a few things. We're going to look at generators, automation, and we're going to look at hosting very, very briefly. So let's start with generators. Lots of people will be familiar with static site generators and have probably come across this one, Jekyll, which is, of course, very, very popular, built on Ruby. Then Jekyll existed, so of course hide had to exist, which is Python. And then there are a bunch of others. There's middleman, there's docpad, there's assemble, there's harp. There's a gazillion of them. In fact, if you go to this site, staticgen.com, you start to see some comparisons of them and see how well supported they are. In fact, there's another site called staticsitegenerators.net, which of course is itself a static site hosted on docpad. It's automated so that the updates come through. There are 274 different static site generator bits of software at the moment. That's quite a lot. I think when I first wrote these slides, there was 220 something. In fact, this morning I had another look and it's 292. I'm not going to keep updating this slide fast enough. This is the hipster tax in full effect again as everyone rolls their own tool for this. But Jekyll is one that's very, very popular, and it's one that I particularly like. And it doesn't come for free. There are things that you need to understand about it. Christian Heilmann mentioned, the fact that the next challenge of the web is us, and he did a talk at Forward.js, I think, that was talking about some of the pain of getting some of these things working. And I think he was calling for a simpler time as well. And this was kind of echoed at the beginning of the year by Remy Sharp, who was saying, okay, well, this is maybe why I was put off trying to run Jekyll. Because he's not a Ruby guy, he's a JavaScript guy, and he was struggling with the environment and finding some pain there. And so this, I think, is an example of, we're trying to simplify, and we're maybe moving away from this huge stack of lots of infrastructure on the back end to a bit of a smaller stack where we're generating things that are static and all of the infrastructure happens in the build environment, but really we want to get to the tiny stack where the number of technologies is even smaller. Dependencies and kind of knowing the prerequisites is something that Aaron Swartz was talking about as well. In fact, he used the dependencies in a slightly different way as well when he was talking about some of the problems with that philosophy. And he was saying, that it's difficult to keep track of which pages depend on what when you're generating it. And I think actually this kind of problem is largely solved now. And the reason for that is that we've got so many rich templating engines. We've seen already a couple of them at work today. And with those templating engines, we've got support for partials and template inheritance and some logic in there as well. So a lot of this stuff is kind of largely solved with the tools that we've got now. If we look at just how many templating engines there are, I'm not streaming this from BitTorrent, I'm afraid to say, this Wikipedia page. But we go down to the templating section, there's just like a load of these different tools for doing templating, and some of them are familiar and some of them are not. But there are plenty on that list. I should probably be a bit careful on this page because there is a section on static site generators, and that kind of lists things like Dreamweaver, Flash, and front page. Those aren't the tools we're looking for. But coming back to this idea of dependencies and the pain that Remy was experiencing, and the call for simplicity that Chris was mentioning. Thankfully, there's this thing called Atwood's Law. Do many people come across Atwood's Law? Yeah, a handful of people. And Atwood's Law states that any application that can be written in JavaScript will eventually be written in JavaScript. And that seems to be becoming more and more the case. This is from back in 2007. And we were looking at the pain that Remy was having with his Ruby environment and kind of installing gems. Well, we've already mentioned NPM, for managing node modules. The team working on NPM recently was saying that it actually stands for no problem meatbag. They want to make sure that if there are people who want to do stuff with it, it's incredibly simple. There's a couple of nice little Easter eggs as well. I really like the fact that a common typo for this is NPM isn't all, and so they implemented that, so you can install with that as well, which is kind of a nice touch. And so if we're thinking about building sites with JavaScript in the front end, using templates that are JavaScript driven, managing dependencies in JavaScript, then we actually get to this point that we're moving from the large stack to the small stack and right the way down to this tiny stack, where the number of skills and technologies you need to understand are getting more and more condensed and refined. Harp.js is a good example of this. This is one of the very many static site generators that we had on that list. But this is built in JavaScript. You install it by npm, and then you get the kind of things that you'd hope to have on a static site generator. You got your pre-processing of templates. You can use JavaScript templating for that. You've got Sass and Less, and you can write in CoffeeScript if that's your thing. But the point is that this ability to rapidly and powerfully generate these sites is another problem that was kind of haunting Aaron at that point when he was saying that he's found an approach, but there are some problems. And I think this is also kind of solved. So let's move along to automation, which is kind of key if we're going to try and make things dynamic out of a static site. Not at the agency I'm at now, but at a previous agency, which I won't name in case they come after me. I had this experience on my first day deploying a site. I arrived and they said, "Oh, Phil, we're having some problems with this site deployment." And it was a site that was fairly high traffic, very conspicuous in the UK. And we were building the site for it and we're deploying it. So I went to see the guy who was doing the deployment, and this was his deployment process. He at his machine, he had one window that had all of the files for the site. And on another window, he had an FTP open, which had the server. And what he would do is he would drag files from one to the other, and then he'd go over and hit refresh, and he'd go, "Nope." And then he'd drag another thing, "No." And my palms immediately went sweaty when I saw that, and it just kind of seems like a perfect way to kind of give yourself some problems. And what we were crying out for there, and what we quickly implemented after that day was automation. And there's already been talk about automation here today, so I don't need to bang on too much about it. But it's so critical when you're trying to make something dynamic and reliable. The fact that you can have something that's repeatable and predictable, you know what the outcome's going to be because you did it so many times before, means you can have a deployment process which is really low friction. You can do it many times a day without sweaty palms. I used to use a tool called Fabric for that, but of course, we've got our friends now, Grunt, Gulp, there's one called Brunch, soon there'll be Belch, Burp, Cough, Sneeze, and this is again, the hipster zone. I don't know if these are registered yet. You're clapping a slide that says snot, sneeze, and cough on it, look at yourselves. If you haven't registered these domains yet, I would go and snap them up because they're going to be big at some point. But some of these are very well known. Gulp is getting a lot more traction at the moment, and I used Gulp on my site. And it just runs my Jekyll build. It does some optimization of some assets and images and what have you, and then it pushes it up to GitHub Pages because that's where I'm hosting it for free. Which brings us on to hosting. As I mentioned, we just talked quickly about that. I'm trying to go quite quickly so we can get to some demos towards the end. The list of things that we could talk about for hosting, is quite long, and there's just a couple of little examples that I might call out. It's really, really simple now to host static sites, as you've probably discovered. This is a nice example of something called Site44, which is essentially, hosting from a Dropbox. Now, we need to be careful that we don't go back into this kind of model, but of course you could easily just automate the pushing of your assets from one folder to another, goes up to Dropbox. It's kind of simple, it's easy, and they do a bunch of other things for you on there as well. GitHub Pages, I think, is anyone, who's heard of GitHub Pages? Okay, almost everyone. It's really, really popular. It's a very well-trodden path. Makes it incredibly simple and cheap to host your static sites. Won't need to go into that too much more. There's another one called BitBalloon, which I really like, which actually allows you just to, to drag and drop a folder onto their site, and immediately it'll just push it up to the cloud, and it'll do a bunch of other things there as well. It'll optimize them. Optimizes all of your assets that you've pushed up there. And it manages the CDN for you, and you can also automate the deployment so you don't have to drag and drop into a browser window. That's not really what I'm advocating, but it's kind of interesting. And they do a bunch of other funky stuff as well. They provide a load of different services and data layers for you to use on top of your static site. Okay, let's get into a couple of examples because that's a little bit more interesting. I'm going to start off with a very simple example, but one of the most important examples, and that is the beer club site for the agency I work at. What could be more important than that? And I choose this as an example really because it's about the simplest site I can possibly imagine. It has an incredibly simple workflow, but the workflow is important nonetheless. And this is one that's powered by nerds. This is the development team who kind of cobbled this together, on their train ride home. Now this is. We're Skinflint, so we want to host it somewhere for free, so it's just pushed up to GitHub Pages, which means, the hosting is taken care of, the version control is taken care of, the deployment is easy, the site generation itself is actually taken care for us by GitHub, because we don't even need to run Jekyll locally. This is a Jekyll site. And, deployment, looks like this. It's very, very simple, and it's predictable. But there are a couple of nice things that happen on here, which is why I mention it. A little while ago, Jekyll introduced more support for data. So they actually give you a data folder now, and you can drop any files you like in there, any YAML files, and whatever you name those will end up being something that you can iterate over in your templates. So, that beer site is just a list of beers, drops of beer. So we have a file called drops.yaml, and it means that we can just iterate over that object in our templates when we render the site. And so, it's a very, very simple thing. It's just a list of stuff, nothing particularly groundbreaking. But one of the things I really like about it, if the video hurries up, I'm not brave enough to do kind of live demos or live coding like some of these other guys. This is really simple just to edit on GitHub. The fact that you can go to GitHub and go to our drops YAML file and edit it right in place. And you make a change there, and GitHub will re-render all your templates and push them out for you. So it kind of takes the infrastructure that you need in your build environment down to zero. Anyone can do this stuff. And as proof of that, I love the fact that the site was forked by another group of people who are not nerds, and they made Cake Club. Now, the style is similar, and I take that as a huge compliment. But the key here is that, again, it's the same simple example, it's the same simple workflow, but this isn't powered by nerds. So this is a bunch of people who just wanted to have a similar site, and they were comfortable creating an account on GitHub and editing a YAML file, which I think is kind of brilliant. So yes, this is incredibly simple, and it seems like it might be just too simple for something that's suitable for us, but simplifying is not dumbing down. Simplifying is something that just lets us focus on the stuff that matters. Now, there's another example of a site that we made at RGA with Google for the DevRel team. And it's actually one that Christian was calling out in a talk, I think, at Forward.js. It's this Web Fundamentals thing that a bunch of people probably saw. Now, this is built with a static site generator, and the reason for that are manyfold. But this actually let us focus on what was important there, and that was the author creation. You could very easily imagine an environment where many authors were building this content that might need some kind of CMS to do it. Well, thankfully, we're working with people who are happy to work in Markdown and render this out quickly. You can contribute to it. It's on GitHub. Christian did call out, that there's some humps to get over to do this. There's some infrastructure you need in place to do that, and he's quite right. And this kind of there. Oh, brilliant. My voice comes back. There are cookies on there that Google probably don't want every agency to be able to write code that might be able to access cookies on that domain. So it's quite difficult to get code deployed there. So this is a way that could kind of happen with some kind of audit and what have you along the way. Now, there are limitations and there are workarounds to those limitations for what you might expect to have in a static site. And so if you're thinking about how dynamic is a static site, there are two places that you might think, well, you're not going to be able to do that. And those are search and comments. And I've got a couple of ways to address that that we can take a look at now. So search, first of all. This again, I keep on favoring Jekyll just because that's the tool I use a lot, but this works just as well for any of the other static site generators. So this example is built on Jekyll. It's a very, very simple search index. Search is a complex thing, but often search doesn't need to be complex for the sites that we're building. There are lots of search tools that could be very, very simply implemented rather than incredibly complex. It's another example of this kind of challenging the need for complexity. So in this case, it's a simple search index. It requires JavaScript. However, there is a progressive enhancement approach, so I'm not just depending on JavaScript completely, which is something that I think is kind of important. So I kind of tested this out on my site, which is a very, very simple blog site. Nothing exciting really happening there, but it's generated by Jekyll, and one of the templates looks a bit like this. This is something that generates the search.json. So you could probably pick this up fairly quickly. The fact that it just iterates over a posts object, and for every item it finds in there, it builds this JavaScript or this JSON object. It's just populating a title, the URL, the date, and then a big blob of all of the words that were in that article. Now, it seems a bit heavy-handed, so we'd try and kind of reduce the size of the index that's in there. So we do things like we strip out all of the HTML, and then it kind of also pipes that to another little function called word map. All that does is it dedupes all of the words in there, and it removes things that maybe aren't going to be useful, like on, in, of, the kind of things that aren't going to be particularly handy in a search, or a simple search at least. And it generates something that looks a bit like this. It's a piece of JSON that just contains all of the posts that are on the site. And with this, it means that we can do very simple kind of inline JavaScript search, which looks a bit like this. If you go to the search there, it just pops up a little search box. And then as you type, it's just looking at that JavaScript object and returning you the results that are in it. Really, really simple. It feels really quick because, of course, it's not going to the server to do any querying and then come back. It's all happening in the browser. That's all fine and good, but a few of you are probably going, well, what are you doing loading the content of every blog post into your site? What about the page weight of that? And that's a sensible concern. So there are a couple of ways to deal with that. First of all, we load this stuff asynchronously. It's not necessary until everything else is rendered, so we load that in after the fact. It's also cached and it's static and it's gzipped to the hilt, so it actually compresses down to be just a big image size. And in fact, we can load it contextually as well, so we don't even need to load it until someone signifies that they're going to go and do some searching. So, example of that, if we just open up the DevTools, we refresh the page, you can see, God, it's hard to see this massive screen. We can see that it's loaded in a bunch of assets for the site, but there's nothing to do with search on there. And then when we go and we click on the search box, then the JSON's loaded in, and it's loaded in quickly, and it's by the time you're ready to start typing, it's there and ready to go. So that kind of reduces this burden of having that search object in the page. And of course, once you've got it throughout the entire site. So it's reasonably efficient. I said at the beginning that yes, it's JavaScript only, but there's progressive enhancement here. How can we possibly make this work without JavaScript? Well, I care a lot about that kind of thing, so I gave that a bit of thought as well. It's just incredibly simple, actually. If we go and turn JavaScript off, and then we load the page again, eventually, then what's happening here is, the clicking on that search clicking on that search navigation uses JavaScript to add that bit of UI we had before, the search box. And without it, all we do is we just navigate to a page, and that page has a search form on it, and that form just goes off and searches the site on Google. Really, really simple. Nothing, no brain surgery there. And the HTML for that is, as you might imagine, pretty simple. It's just a search form. The action is to go to Google, but you hide this other field as well. This where you can specify the site that you're going to search within. It just means that Google is just going to index Google's indexed your site already, and we're just going to be querying within that. Really nice and simple. I think Remy started using a similar approach. He doesn't use Jekyll. He uses Harp.js. But again, he's got a very, very similar approach that he started using there as well. And it's kind of interesting that he's just using a static site generating tool for part of his site. JSBin has lots of things that are a bit more dynamic than that. But this is just one part that he used just in there. Now, comments. I mentioned comments as well. And of course, comments are a particularly valuable part of the web that we all want to have on our blogs. It's interesting, actually, that so many people are turning comments off now, and people are actually saying, "Oh, I love the silence," and having the debate happen elsewhere. But nonetheless, it's a common use case. And Discuss is around. People have known about Discuss for a while as a way of embedding comments on their site. But again, that's two things. That's a JavaScript-only implementation, so the contents don't live within the page. And I like the idea of the comments being part of the content of the site that is there from the get-go. And also, that's pushing the comments about your content to someone else, so that you don't get to keep that very easily. So I kind of like the idea of pulling those contents in and you owning them. Now, in order for this kind of approach to work, you have to consider how timely comments should be. Should they be immediate as someone posts them? Will they be moderated? And very, very often, for the vast majority of times, certainly on projects that I've worked on, people want some kind of comment approval workflow. So, kind of scratched my head about this a little bit, and again, just kind of was experimenting on my own site. And I built this little tool, and it's far from unique, but it's incredibly simple. There's a little tool called Pool, which is intended to be like a little server, a little service to give you access to some dynamic data for your static sites. And it's really simple. Let me explain how it works. You create a form on this thing, and creating a form just gives you two things. It gives you an endpoint, and it gives you an API key, which means that you can post to that endpoint, and it gives you an API secret that you don't share, which means you can request the data back from it. And it means that you can do stuff away from the browser. I mean, you could do it in the browser as well, but of course that would expose your API secret. But if you do it away from the browser, we can use this data kind of interesting ways. So, in any HTML anywhere, or frankly, in curl or wherever you like, you can be posting to this thing. You just set the action of the form to include that API key, and you post to that, and then you just put whatever data fields you want in there. And then when you post to it, it just stashes that data for you. Now, we're posting to another domain here, so the experience for the users they'll be sent to that domain. So you can also give a redirect page as well. So you can say, okay, once the post has happened, send the users here, so they get a slightly more streamlined experience. So they get to see a branded thank you page or wherever you want them to go, and then you just submit it. And it's very, very simple. Simplicity was the kind of key for this. And then later on, you can get that data just by doing a get to using your secret that you haven't disclosed. And you can get that as JSON, or you can get that as YAML. And it's the kind of thing that you can then imagine putting into your automated build infrastructure that we talked about earlier on. So this is what the page looks like once you've got once you're going to see the contents that's been queried. But critically, if you've automated your build structure, there's very little friction for that. This kind of thing actually could become just part of your moderation for tools like that. So I'll just kind of walk you through this kind of quickly in an example. I like the fact that the page this is on is talking about this service, so it's kind of meta. But down at the bottom, there's a bunch of comments there, and add another one quickly. So just stick a couple of fields in there. And then just put a comment in. Now, the sharp eyes amongst you will notice that the name of this conference is not Wuthering Bytes, and a true professional would make sure that they create something appropriate for every event. So we've kind of nailed that. That's fine. That's how we're going to deal with that little bit. And then you post the form, off it goes. And I kind of break down the process a little bit, so just to make it obvious, but this could be a bit more streamlined than this. So you could see it took us to the thank you page, which is the kind of redirect page. And then if we go over to the URL for this form, you can see that the post has been added there. And it also just sends you an email notification to let you know that that's happened. I'm bending my neck. Ugh. So just quickly, just kind of looking at the JSON of that, there it is at the top of the JSON, very, very simple to get, or you can download the YAML, which is what just happened there. But really, we're just going to use it in a build instead. So, forgetting all of the things you just saw, I mentioned earlier on using gulp, have a little gulp task called comments, and all that does is it gets that JSON file, and then it builds into Jekyll, into those data directories that I mentioned before. I've got an object which is all of my comments. So first of all, this is just using the mechanics of Jekyll. Secondly, I've now got those comments. They're not on a third-party service. They're here within my environment, in my repo. And then I run my build as usual, and it just kind of spits out another build, and the page now includes the comment. Now, I use GitHub Pages as my hosting for this, so it needs to be committed to a repo. So rather anxiously, I add that comment and then commit it. I typically would have looked at it. That's your comment moderation step, and then we push it. We just do our deployment as before. And I've broken this down into a number of steps so you can see the steps, but you can conflate some of these and actually make it much simpler. But the key that I'm trying to make here is that with the use of a very simple tool, and there are many like that. There are some that are much richer than that little simple service that I built. You can actually start to bring in what feels like very dynamic content into what would otherwise be a static site. And there it is. Oh, and that's obviously retained. Now, people aren't always very happy with this idea of taking their build infrastructure and kind of adding in things like this, which I can understand for some kinds of sites. This is absolutely fine. For others, this would be insane. There are tools that help with that. I don't know if anyone's come across Factor.io. This is I love their little strapline. It's like if this then that for dev and DevOps. And this is a really interesting tool that helps you kind of monitor anything and then action some kind of build infrastructure. So again, we're kind of splitting away from the old school server-side infrastructure and plumbing, taking one part of it as a service, and then we're just building out our static assets. I'm kind of out of time. But that's fine because lunch is next. But I just kind of want to wrap up with the reason for talking about this is I think it's a good time to have a bit of a call to arms to really seek out chances to simplify. There are lots of conversations I have when 9 minutes, holy moly. Okay, that's great. Maybe we'll have some questions. We can seek out chances to simplify. The idea that everything a client wants is actually something it needs isn't always the case. And so I think it's kind of important to challenge this kind of quest for complexity as a default. Using some of these tools, I think we can make stuff faster, and I think we can make stuff go faster. There are talks later on that talk a little bit about that as well.